You spend time with your family?
Sure I do.
Good. Because a man who doesn't spend time with his family can never be a real man. Come here. You look terrible. I want you to eat. I want you to rest well, and a month from now, this Hollywood big shot's gonna give you what you want.
It's too late. They start shooting in a week.
I'm gonna make him an offer he can't refuse.
In the summer of 2004, Marlon Brando, perhaps the most iconic actor of his generation for his performances in screen classics like A Streetcar Named Desire, On the Waterfront, and The Godfather, put on a blonde wig, a colorful dress, and a full face of women's makeup, and even a pair of white gloves as he sat in his makeshift home studio to record some voiceover tracks for his latest project. Already a living legend for his countless memorable performances from Don Corleone in The Godfather to Colonel Walter E. Kurtz in Apocalypse Now, Brando wasn't shy about taking roles in lesser fare if he could score a big paycheck. And at this stage of his career, he was even willing to do some voice work in animated films if it meant he could get paid handsome sums for just a few hours of work. The actor was constantly in need of cash to meet the demands of his expensive Hollywood lifestyle, not to mention his support obligations for his several ex-wives and 11 children. But just because he took the roles for money didn't mean he would just mail it in when he got the parts, as the actor was well known for bringing the same intense commitment and rigorous method acting principles to every role, regardless of the quality of the material. And that was the case here. Brando was cast to play a character named Mrs. Sour, the owner of a candy company, in an animated feature called Big Bug Man, which starred Brendan Fraser voicing a candy factory worker who gets superpowers after an insect bite. It only called for 1 day of work to record, but Brando was excited about the part and decided to go all in with the makeup and costume to really get into character. The writer-director Bob Benedetson later said he was even told by Brando's people that it had always been one of his dreams to play a woman in an animated movie. Wigs and makeup aside, the recording session was complicated by the fact that the 80-year-old screen legend was quite frail and battling a number of health conditions. A man of famously prodigious appetites, Brando struggled to keep his weight under control, ballooning to over 300 pounds at times in his life, even as he tried everything from fancy diets, meal plans, and even putting a lock on his refrigerator to curb his eating habits. He was now suffering from type 2 diabetes, which created all sorts of other health issues like poor circulation, inflammation of his liver and other organs, and cardiopulmonary problems. His breathing difficulties kept him largely confined to his house and on supplemental oxygen for 6 hours per day. His line delivery was often interrupted by hacking fits, and even when he wasn't coughing, the hiss of the oxygen machines and sounds of other medical equipment in his home would sometimes render the recordings completely unusable. This had been the case in a previous session when he was paid around $500,000 for just 2 hours of voice work, putting cotton balls in his mouth to reprise his famous Don Corleone character for a video game. Still, Brando was committed to continue working even as his health and body began to fail him. But on June 30th, 2004, a groggy Brando started experiencing pronounced breathing difficulties at his home. Although usually able to gather himself with the help of the oxygen tanks, he was struggling more than usual, perhaps from the effects of a powerful prescription opiate called Norco, which helped alleviate his aches and pains, but also had the effect of slowing his breathing and exacerbating his lung condition. Against Brando's wishes, staff members finally called 911, and the actor was rushed to UCLA Medical Center in Los Angeles. Once at the hospital, Brando's x-rays and other tests confirmed the presence of pulmonary fibrosis and a large liver and congestive heart failure. And at around 5:45 p.m., loved ones showed up to Brando's bedside. Shortly thereafter, doctors gave Brando the grim news that he'd need to be put on a ventilator, but the actor, still feisty and headstrong as always, refused. He passed away just 30 minutes later. I'm Derek Kaufman.
I'm Jason Beckerman.
And this is Last Days, Marlon Brando.
Although he was 80 years old and in poor health, the death of Marlon Brando sent shockwaves through Hollywood. He'd been a living legend for decades at this point, and even though he'd withdrawn from the regular industry social scene, Brando had remained active with projects that cashed in on his enormous fame and kept him relevant in the new millennium. The official cause of his death was idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. Pulmonary fibrosis is a chronic condition where the tissue in a person's lungs, which is typically quite elastic to accommodate the inhalation and exhalation of oxygen in a healthy individual, stiffens over time and makes it more and more difficult to breathe. The condition is common in farmers and people with blue-collar jobs like construction workers who inhale dusts and other particulates that can irritate the delicate lung tissues and over time leads to the development of fibrosis. Eventually, the person cannot get sufficient oxygen to vital organs, leading to death. Here, the term idiopathic is key because it's the technical term given to a condition whose causes are unknown. In other words, we know what killed Marlon Brando, but not how he contracted it. In order to fully understand what happened, you need to go back 3 years before his death to 2001, when Brando took a small role in the horror comedy spoof Scary Movie 2. Marlon was paid around $2 million to pay a priest in the film, and reports from the set were that the legendary actor, then in his late 70s, had a difficult time breathing, with several of his takes interrupted by a dry, hacking cough. Such symptoms could be an early indication of the fibrosis developing in his lungs, but he ended up being diagnosed with a bout of pneumonia, which was treated with a course of antibiotics that reduced the swelling in his lungs.
Even if the actor suffered from pneumonia, it's unlikely that such an acute condition bore a direct relationship to the more chronic pulmonary fibrosis condition that ended up killing him. This has left 3 major theories about the underlying cause of Marlon Brando's death, because I remember the Scary Movie incident and, people were concerned, but he had the battle with pneumonia and then he, was healthy again, relatively so. So the theories came down to this, Jason. First, there was a theory that Marlon Brando suffered from the condition as a result of years spent smoking cigarettes. Now, if you just type Marlon Brando smoking cigarettes into Google, you're going to get countless images of the young actor lighting them up, smoking them, and if I'm being completely honest, looking like the coolest dude ever. I mean, Marlon Brando exudes cool in the 1950s, and many pictures of him are just with a cigarette dangling from his lips, that sort of old Hollywood thing. He was like Rebel Without a Cause.
This is the quintessential 2 things can be true at the same time. One is that smoking is horrible and it kills lots and lots of people. As a former tobacco industry lawyer that I am, I can say that. On the other hand, it looks really cool when people in the old days used to smoke.
It does. And Marlon Brando epitomized that sort of cool smoking thing, and people didn't know how dangerous and so forth. So he was a heavy smoker early on in life. He's often credited with making smoking sexy and cool through his movies in the 1950s. And a long-term smoking habit has been associated with the development of pulmonary fibrosis. Here's the problem with this theory, is that Brando actually stopped smoking completely in the mid-1950s, shortly after he filmed On the Waterfront. And although the damage may have already been done at that point, the habit was probably not the primary cause of the lung problems that he suffered later in life.
Let me guess. We're going to go on to obesity because he battled his weight from the time after On the Waterfront all the way through the Godfather years, certainly. And then later in life, he really became unhealthily large.
You can't talk about Marlon Brando without talking about the weight gain. It's such a big part of his story. And that indeed was the second leading culprit that people look to. His obesity, as is well known with obesity, it's behind a multitude of health issues late in life, particularly. And Marlon suffered from overeating throughout his life and the health conditions associated with that. Early in his career, his metabolism kept up with his appetite, and he has this muscular physique and Streetcar Named Desire. It gives little indication that this is a guy who's going to be heavy and obese later in life. But as early as 1958, during the filming of One-Eyed Jacks, fellow actors and crew members started to take notice of Brando's prodigious eating habits, with the actor routinely downing gallons of ice cream and massive steaks. The weight gain was sort of gradual at first. He was a young man, he had a metabolism, but he eventually became quite large, and he tipped the scales at over 300 pounds at points in his life. And he did everything possible to rebel against his Hollywood sex symbol status. So there's 2 things going on with Marlon Brando. He is a sex symbol, Streetcar Named Desire. He's in the tight white shirt and so forth. He hated that. He wanted to be taken as a serious actor. And so the eating habits were sort of a way for him to say, I'm just talented. I'm not just a sex symbol. I'm not a pinup boy. So he sort of leaned into it in certain ways. And there's countless stories on this subject of the weight gain. The most significant are, by the time he was in Apocalypse Now in the late 70s, Brando had reportedly already put on a noticeable amount of weight and became very difficult to work with, pushing for numerous rewrites of the script, complaining about how he appeared on film until they filmed him mostly in shadows to hide his true size. And if you watch Apocalypse Now, he's shrouded in darkness.
I think it actually worked. I'm not sure that Brando...
It's effective.
I'm sure he intended it as a creative choice as much as he wanted to protect himself from being seen that way. But the Kurtz is such a mysterious figure. It really is sort of the essence of his entire character.
Oh, it fits with the entire mood of the movie, but behind the scenes, he was intentionally doing that, in part at least, to sort of hide some of the weight gain. And the struggle with his weight became a constant source of late-night talk show jokes and interview questions. even though Brando tried to downplay things whenever possible, as in this interview with Connie Chung.
No, really, how do you lose weight when you have to lose weight?
You just reach over and turn it off. And stay out of bed, don't sit down, and keep active, and eat fish and vegetables. Do a little bit every day, and then week after week, and the first thing you know, you're dead.
Although the reasons have been debated by armchair psychoanalysts for many years, the reality from those around him was that Brando was just really enjoyed indulging in fatty and sugary foods and had trouble controlling his impulses. A lot of people have talked about his childhood. He had a rough upbringing, but this is a guy who just liked to eat, and he was very wealthy, and he indulged. As mentioned, his weight gain eventually did lead to the development of type 2 diabetes, which put a lot of strain on his other organs and may have exacerbated some of the lung issues. Although it's generally believed that the weight gain was not the root cause of the pulmonary fibrosis. So yes, you can have poor circulation. It can make breathing difficult when you're obese. But he had fibrosis, which is a specific condition caused by particulates in your lungs. And that in and of itself is not related to the obesity.
Yeah.
So this gets to the third theory. And this is where we really get into some strange speculation, but it starts to make a lot of sense. With smoking and obesity contributing at most on the margins to the pulmonary fibrosis, many speculated about the impact of outside pathogens, things in his environment that got into his lungs. And the two leading candidates in Brando's life were chicken poop and mold.
Now watch out, Derek.
Watch out. So Marlon tended to chickens on his property. He had a big estate in Los Angeles, and there's numerous accounts of him cleaning the coops and gathering the fresh eggs on a daily basis. And it's entirely possible that bird feces, other airborne debris in the enclosures, were inhaled by him and could have exacerbated or created some of this lung condition. But the more likely culprit was that there was a huge amount of black mold buildup in his home. When he became reclusive and withdrew, he lived in this very old-fashioned home. There was a lot of mold within it. And because he didn't leave the house at times and it wasn't particularly well ventilated, people pointed to that as a leading contributor to this pulmonary fibrosis condition.
I can't help but think about what the inside and outside of Marlon Brando's house must have been at that point in his life. He is immensely overweight. He's not leaving his house. He's a recluse, as you said. He's got chickens running amok, both inside and outside the house. He's got black mold. He
sounds like a hoarder.
It really
sounds
does.
like
It's sort of a sad tale. I mean, This happens everywhere, right? Old people grow old, and they stop. All people grow old, and they stop caring for themselves. And he was one of those people who really did just sort of give in to all the temptations and sort of give up in a lot of ways late in his life.
And it's difficult for handlers of people as famous as Marlon Brando.
He was not
the story of the padlock on his refrigerator. I mean, if Marlon Brando wants to eat, he's going to say, open the refrigerator.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
You can put these devices in, but at some point, he's just the celebrity of the household and he does what he wants.
So ultimately, there's never going to be an absolute certainty on the precise cause of Brando's death because the actor suffered from so many different health conditions and he was cremated shortly after his death. The actor's sister, Jocelyn Brando, told the press there would be no public service of any kind, noting, quote, Marlon would have hated it. He would not have liked it, and we don't want to do anything he didn't want to do. He's off on his trip, wherever that is. Unconfirmed reports at the time were that Brando wanted a small service led by his neighbor, Jack Nicholson, and that his ashes be scattered over the Tahitian atoll he bought back in 1966. Few actors in history even come close to approaching the legacy of Marlon Brando. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that he revolutionized film acting, pulling the art form forward from the stilted theatrical performances common in the early decades of cinema and representing a new form of intensity and naturalism that frankly hadn't been seen on screen before him. The term most associated with Brando's performance style is method acting because he is generally credited as being one of the first major actors to bring the Stanislavski system of acting into the mainstream. Studying under the legendary Stella Adler, the Stanislavski system, developed in the first half of the 20th century, taps into the actor's conscious thoughts in order to activate subtler subconscious psychological processes. This is why you hear method actors ask, quote, what's my motivation? Before delivering any particular line, they want to fully inhabit the mindset of the character so that it comes through in the performance in ways beyond what they can consciously convey. Stella Adler and Lee Strasberg were two of the most important figures in popularizing this approach to acting, and Brando studied directly under Stella Adler, and famously Lee Strasberg obviously plays a role in the second Godfather film, which was cast specifically as a tribute to his teachings and Marlon Brando in particular. Other actors from the time, including James Dean, Marilyn Monroe, Al Pacino, Robert De Niro, Harvey Keitel, Dustin Hoffman, and Ellen Bernstein, all studied the system and went on to become some of the most important artists of their generations.
We take it for granted that this is just what acting is, but if you think back to Humphrey Bogart, Clark Gable, the style was much more theatrical, much more stagey. It's not that Humphrey Bogart wasn't a great actor.
Watch most 40s and 50s movies, and it's that over-the-top, almost stage acting where you're really conveying something with sort of a false, overly articulating kind of style.
It doesn't seem natural.
And it doesn't seem natural,
Yeah.
right? And that's what people, movies were just moving action that used to be depicted on a stage.
Yes.
And you still see that in stage, that really sort of almost campy, indulgent style.
Sure.
Movies are now so much more real, and you have sort of the Stanislavski method. You have Lee Strasberg, and you have Marlon Brando to thank for that.
It really is. He really just ushered in what we think of as modern acting way back in the 50s. And after cutting his teeth on stage in the 40s, Brando really burst onto the scene as just one of the most exciting new film presences the world has ever seen in Elia Kazan's 1951 adaptation of the Tennessee Williams play, A Streetcar Named Desire. Starring Vivien Leigh as a Southern belle dealing with a series of personal problems and shacking up with her sister and brother-in-law in a rundown New Orleans apartment, the film really depended entirely on the performances of the cast. This wasn't a big-budget blockbuster like Gone with the Wind. This was a small stage play turned into a movie. And nobody was bigger than Vivien Leigh at the time, who famously portrayed Scarlett O'Hara in the massive hit film Gone with the Wind a little over a decade earlier. But it was newcomer Marlon Brando playing the explosive, abusive, but somehow sexy Stanley Kowalski that stole the movie and created one of the most memorable scenes in film history.
Hey, Stella! Hey, Stella!
He garnered an Academy Award nomination for Best Actor, and many credit the performance with ushering in this age of the complicated anti-hero, which is a complexity not often seen in the simplistic good versus evil storylines of the previous era of cinema. And Jason, you know, any film class you go to, you see that scene of him yelling, "Stella, Stella," and he's a guy who's important to the film. You want to hate him, but you sort of end up empathizing and almost rooting for him. And that is the crux of what an anti-hero is. And you don't have those kind of characters earlier on. You have them post Marlon Brando.
You have to contextualize this, right? Vivien Leigh, as you pointed out, coming off Gone with the Wind, is one of the most famous actresses in the world. And you have this sort of upstart that people have been hearing about, but he comes in and he steals this movie. It is his movie. A Streetcar is a Marlon Brando movie, despite the fact it's by all accounts a Vivien Leigh movie.
That's right. It's about her. She's the main character,
That's
but
right.
it is truly stolen by this young presence of Marlon Brando. And building on the momentum of Streetcar, Brando would then nab Oscar nominations the next 3 years in a row for Viva Zapata, Julius Caesar, and of course, On the Waterfront. And it was his role in On the Waterfront as Terry Malloy, a former prize fighter whose career is cut short after throwing a fight for a local mob boss, that would earn Brando his first Best Actor win.
You was my brother, Charlie. You should have looked out for me a little bit. You should have taken care of me just a little bit so I wouldn't have to take them dives for the short end money.
Well, I had some bets down for you. You saw some money.
You don't understand. I could have had class. I could have been a contender. I could have been somebody. Instead of a bum, which is what I am.
I hadn't thought about this before. He's perhaps has 3 of the 10 most famous lines in movie history. I should have been a contender. Stella.
Offer you can't refuse.
And an offer I can't refuse. All Brando. I mean, that's obviously screenwriters, but
it's his delivery.
It's
as bound with him. Yes, as the screenwriter, but he just absolutely slays it. So it's his performance that's carrying this movie. It's really just a masterclass in portraying that wounded male ego as he wrestles with the still flickering bravado of a former champion. And that became, in the 50s, sort of his stock in trade. Stanley Kowalski, Terry Malloy, these are complicated guys. They're dark. They're wounded in lots of ways, but there's this machismo within them. So you would think after the 50s, this guy is on a rocket ship to fame. But during the 60s, his career takes this noticeable downturn as the actor's problems, the overeating, the extravagant indulgences, his financial issues, and several failed marriages start to rear their ugly head in his life. And he had a series of box office failures, including starring in and directing a movie called One-Eyed Jacks and leading a big-budget production of Mutiny on the Bounty, which also didn't do well. And they did serious damage to his professional reputation. And although still in his late 30s and early 40s during the decade, many started to just write off Marlon Brando as a has-been, as this new crop of handsome young actors, Warren Beatty, Paul Newman, and Robert Redford, started their rise. And so the late 60s, you're seeing Bonnie and Clyde, and it's like, Marlon Brando's a has-been. He's old hat. Let's go with Warren Beatty. And then this happens.
Yeah, of course. Brando's resurgence in the 1970s cemented his legacy as one of the finest film actors in history. His total and complete transformation into Don Corleone for Francis Ford Coppola's masterpiece, The Godfather, essentially created the standard by which all other mafia movies are measured and landed Brando his second Best Actor award.
Buonasera. Buonasera. What have I ever done to make you treat me so disrespectfully? If you'd come to me in friendship, then the scum that ruined your daughter would be suffering this very day. And if by chance an honest man like yourself should make enemies, then he would become my enemies. And then they would fear you.
Because it's become so iconic and so often parodied, it's easy to forget just how effective Brando was as Don Corleone. There's a quiet menace at the heart of his most effective scenes. He's sort of the velvet glove of mob bosses, but can fly into fits of rage, blending the attributes of his sons, the hot-headed Sonny and the Machiavellian sinister cool of Michael. I've often said, whenever anybody will listen to me, that the most impressive piece of acting in the world is when Don Corleone calls the five families together because he's had an assassination attempt on his life, and he's trying to bring everybody together to bring peace. And he's accused by the other family members of having the police and the politicians in his pocket. And he just does this thing where he just tilts his head to the side and throws his hands up. Like, what can I do? He's conveying that. He doesn't say, what can I do? What can I do? This is who I am. This is what I have. And that's okay. You can have yours too. And it's the single most effective, totally wordless piece of acting I've ever seen.
Yeah.
And
it's true subtlety.
scene.
You're right, because often it's not verbal. He's not a loud character. He is sort of quiet and understated in his most effective scenes, and yet he's scary as hell.
He's scary as hell. You can say shit. It's okay. Yeah. And yet somehow there's a sweetness to the death scene as he plays with his grandchild while stuffing oranges into his mouth in The Godfather. Here's this monster responsible for countless deaths playing an innocent game with a small child, and you can't help but feel sympathy for him. The simmering intensity and control of Don Corleone showcased one side of Brando's immense talent, but he closed out the 70s with one of the most unhinged performances in cinematic history as Colonel Kurtz in Coppola's Vietnam saga Apocalypse Now. The stories, Derek, they are just legion about the set of Apocalypse Now. Martin Sheen suffered a heart attack. Francis Ford Coppola reportedly tried to commit suicide 3 times in the set. I've heard that story. I don't really believe. Coppola was too much.
He would put a gun to his head.
He was too much of a narcissist to actually do it, but yeah. And the film's budget ballooned as the production dragged on for 16 months after initial estimates were for 6 weeks only. But the strangest part of the shoot might have been Brando's bizarre rewrites and ridiculous demands to be filmed almost entirely in darkness. We talked about this. He was illuminated only slightly near his face and covered in shadows, reportedly to conceal his massive weight gain and resulting in bizarre but indelible scenes like this one about the horrors of Vietnam.
Horror has a face. And you must make a friend of horror. Horror and moral terror are your friends. If they are not, then they are enemies to be feared. They are truly enemies.
So I think, Jason, this is sort of the end of his big moments in cinema. Apocalypse Now is so bizarre, but so effective. And he's incredible in it. It's really a haunting movie just to hear him speak.
Before we go into what's going to be the last sort of sad demise of his career, where does he stand, Eric? I mean, are we talking in terms of the importance of American actors, of world actors? You know, he's in the, it's sort of, you know, you got Bogart, right?
He's on Mount Rushmore.
Invented movie star.
Yes.
And he's up there as the most important, certainly American actors of all time.
I think he is. He's undoubtedly, you've got like the Humphrey Bogart of the old generation. And then I think Marlon Brando is the quintessential modern actor. You would maybe think of Robert De Niro, Al Pacino, and Jack Nicholson, but those guys really were in his footsteps.
Yeah, exactly.
Even think of Robert De Niro. His biggest burst onto the scene was playing Don Corleone, the character that he made so indelible in the first Godfather. So I really think he stands alone with those guys. Maybe currently you have guys like Daniel Day-Lewis who are really
not American, but that's sort of also a profound method actor, well known as a method actor, giant pain in the ass on set as well.
He thought he was Lincoln for many, many months before he even filmed the role and so forth and asked to be called president. He's in that category. He really is.
I mean, you got sort of Hanks and Cruise, but they're more, I think you said this earlier, they're movie stars as opposed to maybe not as important, although Hanks, I guess, is an important cinematic actor.
Yeah, they're great, but they're like big Watt smiles and things like that. You think of Brando, you think of, you're getting an incredible performance.
You really are. I mean, you got the Godfather film, you have Apocalypse Now. You have Last Tango in Paris, that is a widely derided film because a lot of the onstage stuff, there were some allegations of really bad stuff. We don't have to get into it, but that performance, his performance in that movie it's sublime. I mean, it's one of the great performances ever, and it's overlooked because the movie hasn't really held up.
Yeah,
but he was well regarded at his time as one of the greatest performances ever on stage.
It's really a testament to his greatness that he had these two periods where he really wasn't great, and he was doing paycheck movies, the 60s, and as I'll talk about, the remainder of his career after Apocalypse Now, it's really a reflection of that icon status, but also his desperate financial situation. He's taking paycheck after paycheck to pay ex-wives, support his children, and really retreating from the true acting challenges that had defined the first 3 decades of his career when he was at the top of his game. But even coasting along on his legendary status sometimes yielded a memorable scene or two, as with his bizarre, pale-faced performance as the eccentric old guy trying to hybridize humans and wild animals in The Island of Dr. Moreau. Have you seen that?
Nope.
He's sort of like tapping into some of the energy of Apocalypse Now, but it's even sort of stranger in a way. But for the most part, it was a sad conclusion to one of the finest acting careers in Hollywood history, punctuated by him donning that wig and dress as he wheezed through some voice work in his dimly lit and mold-infested mansion just months before his death. And it's really staggering to think about now in light of his incredible legacy. But Francis Ford Coppola actually had to fight the studio to cast Marlon Brando in the role of Don Corleone. And to this day, whenever the topic of working with Brando comes up, Coppola invariably brings up the story of Brando's impromptu audition that was the genesis of one of the most important characters in film history. We now think of Coppola as one of the masters of directing, certainly a legend in his own right, but he tells the story with a boyish enthusiasm that you might expect from someone meeting his big screen idol for the first time. And it's a reminder that even before he filmed what would become, in many people's minds, his most lasting performance, Brando was already a towering figure in film and a huge part of Hollywood history. And so I wanted to give Coppola, whose own name and legacy have become inextricably bound with Brando, the final word with that story of how Don Corleone came to life.
He was shot in the throat. In the book, he was shot in the throat. So he talks like that, maybe. And I said, yeah, I'm filming. And then he said he should look like a bulldog. And he took some Kleenex and he put the Kleenex like that. And then he started like acting, but not saying anything. And it was in his house. And I'm shooting, and we're all shooting, and he starts going, and the phone rings. His phone rings over here. I don't know who is calling him, but he goes, so at any rate, it was a miraculous transformation. It was the birth of that character.